Hey guys, welcome. Today we're going to set up a dialogue system so we can talk to our NPCs. Years ago, I followed several tutorials on this topic, and I was frustrated because most of them were a little too simple to handle the needs of my project. So, with that in mind, this tutorial is going to show you how to make your NPCs interactable in a super modular way. We're going to build a dialogue system from start to finish, including the ability to type out the dialogue letter by letter. I will also show you how to fix this, where the word changes lines halfway through being typed. And we can finish the typing early by pressing the interact button again. This tutorial is going to cover abstraction as well as interfaces. If you're new to those, do not worry, I will explain it all as we go. Let's get started. Okay, so here's our opening scene. This is really simple stuff. We have a player and we have an NPC. The NPC has a script on him called Wraith, but as you can see, that script is completely blank, so we're starting from scratch here. So the first thing I want to set up is the ability to interact with this NPC. And we're going to set this up in a way that might at first seem like it's a little bit more work. There are more straightforward ways of doing this, but if you build your systems the way that you see in this tutorial, then you can save yourself a lot of time, and you'll see what I mean really soon. So I'm not going to touch this script just yet. What I first want to do is create a new script called NPC. Okay, let's open that up. So what I want to do is use this NPC class as a base for any NPC that we might have in our game. So it doesn't matter whether it's just an NPC that you can have a conversation with, or it could be a shopkeeper or whatever else. So we're going to use this as the base. So what we are going to do is change this to a public abstract class. By adding abstract in here, this will allow us to create abstract methods, which are basically blank methods that have no implementation. So that'll all make sense very soon. So first I want to add an update method. We just want to look for some sort of keyboard press, which will be our interact button. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to say using unityengine.inputSystem. If this doesn't show up for you, make sure that you install the input system package. Okay, so now we can say if keyboard.current.eKey.was pressed this frame. If we do that, then we want to interact with this NPC. Now we could just go down here and set up an interact method, but what we're going to do instead, I'm going to go into my interfaces folder and I'm going to create a new script called Interactable. Okay, and let's open that one up. This is going to be the shortest script you've ever seen in your life. Let's get rid of mono behavior and replace class with interface. Now, interfaces, kind of like abstract methods, you can't have an implementation of a method in here. So I want to create a method called interact. And this is as far as we can go. I can't actually, create a method like this. It's not going to let us do that in an interface. Okay, and it's worth noting so far that both of these scripts that we have set up, they are not attached to our NPC game object. We're not going to attach them to our NPC game object. So far, we still just have this blank Wraith script over here. But what I want to do is go back to your NPC script, and we are going to go over here beside mono behavior, and we are going to put comma and add Interactable. Okay, now when you do that, we're going to get an error that says NPC does not implement the interface member. That's because when you add an interface to a class, you have to implement it. There is no choice. What that means is we have to implement this method in our NPC script now. So you can actually just right click this, go to quick actions and refactor and implement interface, and that'll generate it for you right here. Let's get rid of this. Okay, so now if we hit the E key, then we are going to call the interact function. So we're wanting to set up a dialogue system. So you would think that when we call our interact, we want to set up some sort of start the dialogue code here. But we also said that this NPC is going to act as a base for any kind of NPC. So this could also act as a base for an NPC that you can't talk with. Maybe it'll open up a shop system instead, or an upgrade system or something like that. So what we are actually going to do is get rid of these curly braces, and we are going to add the abstract keyword to our interact function. That's why we made the class abstract. You cannot add abstract methods into a class unless the class is abstract. And an abstract method means we can override it in another script. We don't have to implement or put any code in here right now. We can fill that out later because right now we don't know what we want this to do exactly. Now there is one thing that I would like this class to actually do. We want to be able to interact with this NPC when our player gets close enough. And in order for our players to know that you're able to interact with this guy, I'd like to give some sort of UI indication that you are in fact able to talk to this guy. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a sprite that just sits above his head, and we'll activate it when we are close enough to be able to interact with him, and we'll deactivate it when we're not close enough to interact with him. So let's set up a serialized field, private sprite renderer. We'll call this interact sprite. Okay, and by adding the serialized field here, that will make it available for us to set directly in the inspector. So now we want to set up a method to check the distance between this NPC and the player. And in order to do that, we're going to need to grab a reference to the player. So let's just set up a private transform called player transform. and we'll grab that once in a start function. So let's say player transform is equal to GameObject.findGameObject with tag player.transform. And let's make sure that our player is set to the player tag. Okay, so now we have a reference to the player's transform. So let's set up a method to check the distance. We'll go down here and we'll say this is a private bool called isWithinInteractDistance. Okay, so we're going to say if vector2.distance, and that's just going to check the distance between A and B. Well, A is going to be our player transform.position, and B is just going to be this game object's transform.position. If that is less than some sort of arbitrary number, let's call it 5 for now, well then we'll return true, else we'll return false. And let's set up a constant float instead of just keeping a number here. We'll go up here, let's say private const float interact distance is equal to 5f, and we'll throw that down there instead. So we are going to need to check this in our update. So we're going to check if this interact sprite is inactive, and if we are within the interact distance, then we will enable it. So if the interact sprite.gameObject.active self, and we are not within the interact distance, if that's the case, then we'll turn off the sprite. Else, if the sprite.gameObject is not active and is within interact distance, well then we'll turn on the sprite. So we'll do that by saying interact sprite.gameObject set active false, and we'll copy that and just turn that to true instead down here. Now let's not forget that we only want to be able to interact with the NPC if we have pressed the E key and we are within the interact distance. Okay, so I'd like to test this, but first, remember we said that this is not connected to our game object in the scene whatsoever. But all we need to do is go into our empty Wraith script, and instead of inheriting from mono behavior, we are going to make this inherit from NPC. Okay, and as soon as we do that, you're going to get an error on our class. Wraith does not implement inherited abstract member. So it's going to force us to implement that abstract method, interact, finally, in this script. Okay, so we're going to right click, go quick actions and refactoring, implement abstract class. Okay, and that gives us a public override void interact. So this is where we'll put the real code for what we want the interact to do for our Wraith NPC character. So this is really cool. We've got some code in our NPC class here, but we added an interact functionality by adding an Interactable interface. You can add as many interfaces as you want to a class. So what you can do with interactables and abstract classes together, if you combine them, you can use interfaces to give you these little tiny chunks of functionality that you want your NPC to have. Do we want all NPCs to be interactable? Well, yes, we do, right? Another example is, let's say this was not an NPC class. Let's say this was a barrel class, just a barrel that's sitting in our scene. Well, maybe we want to have different kinds of barrels. Maybe we want one normal barrel that just breaks when you hit it and another barrel that explodes when you hit it. So we could add an iDamageable interface to the normal barrel and an iDamageable interface and an iExplodable interface to the explosive barrel. So you can add these little chunks of functionality by adding interfaces to your classes. I hope that makes sense. Now, moving on. So let's actually set up this interact sprite so that we can test this properly. So right here in my NPC, I am going to add an empty called InteractObject. I'm going to add a sprite renderer to that. I'm just going to search for arrow here and use the first one that comes up. This is a really small one that comes with Unity, so I'm going to have to scale that up. It will look a little bit pixelated, but that's fine. So we can actually just leave this on because all the code we just wrote will take care of whether or not we want this to be on or off. So what I'm going to do is go up here to my NPC and just plug in that sprite renderer right there. Let's try that. Okay, nothing yet. There we go. It's right there. If we leave, it disappears there. There you go. I would just like to make this a little bit less ugly. So really quick, I'm going to add an animator to that. I'm going to create an interactable animator controller. I'm going to click here. I'm going to click animation. I'm going to click create new animation. I'm going to add that to my animation folder. Create an interactable folder. Just call that arrow. I'm going to click the record button and just move it down just slightly. So at about 30 frames, I'm going to drop that down just a little bit, and then back at 1 second, we're going to bring that back up to where it was at the start. You can copy and paste those frames just like that. There you go. That's a little bit better. Using an animator in a tiny little project like this is totally fine. But if you're working on a commercial game or something like that, you're probably going to want to use a tweening library instead. Using an animator is more computationally expensive, but I'm not going to do that here because that's outside the scope of this tutorial. Okay, now I want to give this NPC the ability to talk. So I'm going to go into my scripts and I'm going to create one more script called iTalkable. Okay, so let's get rid of mono behavior and change this to an interface again. And we're going to set up a public void talk. Okay, so now it's time to decide how we want to actually store the text for our conversation, because we need to pass in something in these parentheses, and we need to know exactly what it is we're referencing. There's many, many ways that you can do this, but we are going to do this using a scriptable object. So before we can finish this, we need to set up one more script. I'm going to create a new folder called dialog, and I'm going to create a new script called dialog text. Okay, so this script is going to have nothing to do with our game objects. What it's going to allow us to do is create a data file that stores all of our text. So we are not going to inherit from mono behavior because mono behavior belongs on classes that sit on top of game objects. This is going to be a scriptable object, and we only need two pieces of information. We want a speaker name and a string array called paragraphs. Okay, so this is just the name of the speaker. Obviously, this is going to hold all of our actual conversation text. And last thing, what we want to do is come up here above the class, and we want to add the create asset menu attribute. Okay, you can just tab to autofill that. And we are going to set up dialog, new dialog container. All right, so I'm going to create a new folder called SOs. And check this out. If we go in there and we right click, if you go to create, now you have this dialog option up here and we have new dialog container. The script we just did allows us to create that. So when we click it, it creates a tiny little file called new dialog text. I'm just going to call that test conversation. So right now we've got space to type in a speaker name. This guy's name is obviously Joey. And this is not a lot of space to actually write out full-on conversations. So let's expand this a little bit. And we can do that by going above our paragraph string here and adding the text area attribute. And I like them nice and big. Let's go 5 for the minimum and let's go 10 for the max lines before we actually have to start scrolling down. There you go. That's much better. We're going to fill in some test text here. Another common thing that you might want to add is to add an image here if you're wanting to have your NPC's face show up on the dialog box. Okay, so now that we have this, let's go back to our iTalkable. Now we know what we want to pass in here. We're going to be interacting with dialog text. So we're going to pass in a dialog text. Let's just call that dialog text. Okay, there we go. Now let's get this guy talking. We're going to go back to our Wraith script, and now he is inheriting from NPC, which already has a whole bunch of functionality, but we are going to now add the ability to talk. And to do that, we're just going to add comma, iTalkable. We can right click, quick actions, implement interface. So finally, in our interact function, we are going to add the talk function, and we need to pass in a dialog text. So let's set that up here. I'm going to say serialized field, private dialog text, dialog text. And now we can pass that in to our talk function. Right, so hopefully you understand how this works. We created the NPC class. All NPCs are going to be interactable. That's why we added interactable to the NPC class, not our Wraith class. We might as well add it to the NPC class because all NPCs are going to be interactable, but not all of them are going to be shoppable or talkable. So if we were setting up a shop system instead, everything we've done so far could still be used for the whole interact functionality, except instead of calling a talk function here, which comes from the iTalkable interface, we would have something like an shoppable interface, and we would pass in shop here in our interact function. So that's a really cool way that you can combine abstract classes with interfaces to be able to put together these building blocks that you can use again and again for multiple characters in your game, but then you can add functionality at the very end. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So now it's time for us to actually set up the dialogue system properly. We're now in the talk function and we need to give him the ability to talk. And to do that, we need to set up some UI. So I'm just going to right click in my hierarchy. I'm going to create a UI image. Let's call that dialog box image. So I want this kind of close to the top. So we're going to click right here and we're going to hit Shift Alt and click this one right here. That'll set its pivot and its position to be in the top center. I would like it to come down just a little bit, and let's make this a nice 700 by 250. Now this looks really, really big, but our canvas here is set to constant pixel size, which means even when we're full screen, this is going to be exactly the same. So if we set that to scale with screen size, now it will dynamically adjust its size based on the size of our screen. So I think I'd actually like something more like 300 and 100, because when we hit play, that seems like a pretty good size. All right, let's make that slightly transparent. And now let's add some text in here. Right click, go to UI and click Text, Text Mesh Pro. If you don't have it installed in your project, you're going to have to click Import TMP Essentials. Okay, when that's done, you can just close it. I'm going to call this NPC name. I would like this text box to take up the entire dialog box image. So let's click here and let's hit Shift, Alt, and Stretch, which will make it take up the entire thing. Let's give that a font size of 15. Let's bring that 10 over from the left. Let's just make that kind of a dark gray. Now let's right click over here again, UI, More Text Mesh Pro, call this dialog text. We're going to do the same thing. Click here. We're going to hit Shift, Alt, Stretch. Let's make this something a little bit smaller, like 12. Let's bring it down from the top by about 20 and 10 from the left so it matches our name. And let's make that pure black. Okay, so this whole thing is going to act as a shared dialog box that all NPCs in our game can use. So this is going to need a dialog controller script. So let's add that onto our dialog box image and open that up. Okay, so this is where we're going to actually set up the method that we call in our Wraith script right here to start the conversation. We don't want to set up all that functionality in the Wraith script. We want to control the dialogue for everything in the game in one nice dialog controller script. So we're going to be updating the NPC name and the dialog text. So let's grab references to those. We're going to need to add the using TM Pro namespace for Text Mesh Pro. Now we can say serialize field, private, Text Mesh Pro GUI, NPC name text. And one more called NPC dialog text. So way back over in our dialog text, you'll remember we set up a string array called paragraphs. So we're going to need something similar in the dialog controller as well. However, I don't want to use an array of strings. There's something better we can use, and it's called a queue. We're going to set up a private queue of type string called paragraphs. And we're going to initialize that as a new queue of type string. So a queue acts similarly to a list. What we're going to do is we're going to load up all the paragraphs here, no matter how many it is. We'll add those into our queue. We'll read them off one at a time, and then we'll remove them from the queue, and then just load up whatever's next in the queue. So next, what I want to do is set up the method that we are actually going to call right here, which is a public void display next paragraph. And we do not need to grab a reference to our dialog text in this script because we have it right here in our Wraith, and we can pass that in from our talk function. So let's just add a parameter of dialog text called dialog text. So before I actually set this up, let's go back to our Wraith, and we want to grab a reference to this dialog controller here and call this function before we forget. So I'm going to add a serialized field, private dialog controller. And we can go in here and say dialog controller dot display next paragraph dialog text. So we're calling this straight away. So we need to handle what's going to happen if there's nothing in the queue. And right now there is nothing in the queue. We've just initialized a completely blank queue. So we can say if our paragraphs dot count is equal to 0. Now there's two reasons that our queue might be blank. We either just loaded it up and we haven't started the conversation yet, or we've gone through all of the conversations and we're at the end and there's nothing left to say. So we're just going to add a little private bool called conversation ended. So if our paragraphs.count is equal to 0 and our conversation is not over, so if conversation ended is false, then we want to start a conversation. Else we want to end the conversation. And we can go ahead and create those methods right now. Private void start conversation and private void end conversation. And we can plug those in right now. So we've got a couple of things to do. We need to fill in the start conversation, the end conversation, and this is all handling if there is nothing in the queue. We also need to handle if there is something in the queue. Okay, so I'm going to start with start conversation. What do we want to do when we want to start the conversation? Well, this dialog controller is sitting on the dialog image. So if that is not active, then we want to activate it. So let's say if this game object is not active, then we're going to say GameObject.setActive is true. So now we have our dialog box active in the scene, and it's just going to show up just like this. So let's update the name. So we grabbed a reference to that right up here, NPC name text. So let's copy that, bring that down here and say NPC name text.text is equal to, and now we need to get a reference to the dialog text again. Now we are calling start conversation from within display next paragraph, which has dialog text there. So really we can actually just copy and paste this over to here and then say NPC name text.text is equal to dialog text.speaker name. Now finally, let's actually add all of this dialog text into this queue. So remember, this is an array of type string. So we're going to need to iterate through each one of those. And in order to do that, we need to add a for loop. You can type for and double tap your tab key and it'll generate that for you. But we want to say if I is less than dialog text dot paragraphs dot length. So that is the length of the paragraphs array within the dialog text. So to add those to the queue, we're going to say paragraphs dot enqueue. And what are we adding? The dialog text dot paragraphs of the current index. Okay, so .enqueue will add one item into our queue, but we're running this for loop, which means it's going to run as many times as is necessary to work through all of these paragraphs over here. Let's not forget to add dialog text into our start conversation method there. And let's also not forget to assign these right here. Let's drag down our NPC name there and our dialog text there. And let's make sure that's not active. And finally, let's not forget to go to our NPC and assign these over here as well. So our dialog controller is sitting on our dialog box image, and our dialog text, we can actually click right there. We only have one, so let's click that one, test conversation. And if we hit the E key, all right, so it displays as we expected, and it populates his name, Joey. Awesome. Now, before we go on to add, if there is something in the queue, let's just quickly fill out the end conversation as well, since we already have that method. So the first thing we're going to want to do when we end our conversation is clear the queue. And then remember, we set up this conversation ended bool up here. We're going to want to set that back to false. And we're going to want to deactivate this game object again. So if it is active, then we are going to say GameObject.setActive false. Now, the other thing is if we're here, if our paragraphs.count is equal to 0, meaning there's nothing in the queue, and we have actually ended our conversation because we've reached the end of the queue, then we're going to want to call end conversation, but we're not going to want to call everything that we run down here. And in order to exit out of this method early, we can add return. That means if this is called, then return will exit out of this method and nothing that we create down here will get called. So if there is something in the queue, the first thing that we're going to want to do is dequeue the first item from the queue. So I'm going to go up here and set up a private string. I'm just going to call it P. And we're going to go down here and we're going to say P is equal to paragraphs.dequeue. That is going to assign the very top item in our queue to this P string variable. Now we can actually update our conversation text. So we can do that by going up here, grabbing the NPC dialog text and say that .text is equal to P. And finally, now that we've actually dequeued something, we are going to check if our paragraphs.count is equal to 0 one more time. This time, if it is 0, then we have definitely ended the conversation. Otherwise, it would have been called right here. So if we've gone through all of this, and now after our last dequeue, our paragraphs.count is equal to 0, that means that we were on the second last conversation, and now we're on the last conversation. So we are going to say conversation ended is equal to true. Okay, let's test that. I would like to add a second paragraph to this just to make sure. Okay, so let's try that. So we're going to walk right up. We're going to press the E key. You can see he correctly displays the first paragraph as well as the second one when we hit the E key another time. And if we hit E a third time, it closes that up. And by the way, I'm not going to handle it in this tutorial, but you do want to make sure that when you have started a conversation that your character is not able to move. And I'm not going to handle that in this tutorial because how that works really depends on your project and how your character is set up. But just don't forget to make sure that when you have started a conversation that you take away the ability to move your player. If you have some sort of player movement script, you might just want to deactivate that at this time. Okay, so we have our dialogue system working correctly now. However, I would like to add the ability to type the conversation out letter by letter. So in order to do that, we're going to go up here and we're going to set up a private coroutine variable. I'm going to call that type dialogue coroutine. Okay, so we've set that up. We're going to want one more variable and it's going to be a bool called isTyping. We just want to be able to track when we're typing and when we're not. So I'm going to copy and paste something into my project that I threw together earlier, but please do not copy this code because we are going to do it better. I just want to show you this for the sake of example. Okay, so there's that. So all I need to do is set up a speed, which I forgot about. We obviously want to be able to control the speed that the letters appear. So we're going to set up a serialized field, private float type speed. I'm going to default that to something like 10. So you can find this in a lot of different tutorials online. So we're passing in our paragraph here and we have an index that grabs each letter. We iterate through that index and then we display it. So what we are going to do, and this part, this line here, you can type because we're going to call the coroutine the same thing. So we are going to get rid of this thing here. We don't want to update it all at once. What we want to do is say if If we are not typing, so if is typing is false, then we want to do our DQ, and we want to say type dialog coroutine is equal to start coroutine type dialog text. And we are going to pass in our P right there, which again, we just set that by dequeuing the top item in our paragraphs queue. So let's test that and see what happens. And I'm going to need a second line to actually test it properly. Okay, so it is typing letter by letter. It's going fairly slowly. I could have sped it up a little bit. So can you see how as it's typing out, the word actually starts being spelled and then it actually realizes, oh, it's not going to fit on this line, and it throws it into the next line. It looks really weird and kind of janky and just unprofessional. So let's fix that. So this code right here, this coroutine, you'll find a lot of different variations of this if you look online for how to do a dialogue system. And this is literally typing out one character at a time. And so when you think about it that way, it actually makes sense that these words start spilling into the next line because they don't actually know what their proper position is supposed to be. They're literally just being typed out one letter at a time. What we are actually going to do is we are going to display the entire message right at the start, and then we are going to insert an alpha character right at the beginning. And by doing that, it's going to make all of the letters invisible. And then we are going to move and iterate that alpha character one letter at a time through our full conversation, which is already in its proper place, revealing one letter at a time. So that's how this is going to work. So we can comment this one out. We don't need that anymore. And now let's type out the proper one. So we're going to set up still an enumerator, and we'll call it the same thing, type dialog text. And we'll take in a string called P. So if this is running, then we want to set is typing to be true. We have a check for that right here. So we want to make sure that we update that accordingly, once at the beginning and once at the end. So before we enter any kind of loop, let's just make sure that we have no text displaying so that it's nice and clean. So I say NPC dialog text dot text is equal to quote unquote, just blank. Now we're going to set up two strings, one called original text and one called displayed text. Now our original text is going to be equal to P, which we are passing in. And if you recall, P is the dequeued paragraphs here, meaning it's just one of these two, or if there were 10, it's still just one of those 10. Displayed text is also going to be initialized as a blank. And we need to set up an integer called alpha index. And we'll initialize that at 0. Okay, so now we need to actually set up a loop so that we can move this alpha index one character at a time. So we're going to say for each, double tap your tab key. All right, what is the variable type? It is a character. We're going to call it C. And what are we grabbing that from? We're grabbing that from our P.toCharacterArray. Okay, and so this is essentially just breaking this down into an array of characters or letters. So now as we iterate through each and every one of those letters, we want to iterate our alpha index. Okay, now as we said, we also want to display all of our text right at the start. We're just going to make it invisible. So to display all of the letters, we're going to say NPC dialog text dot text is equal to original text, which we set as P. Next, we want to actually insert the alpha character. And before we do that, I want to set up a constant string variable. So we're going to go up here and we're going to say private const string. I'm going to call that HTML alpha. That is going to be equal to open close quote, color equals hashtag, and we want 8 zeros. And I only say that because I find zeros hard to count on monitors. I don't know if I'm the only one. They all blend together for me for some reason. Anyways, let's grab a reference to this. And now let's come back down here and update our displayed text. So our displayed text is going to be equal to NPC dialog text dot text dot insert. Okay, so it wants an index and a string value. Our index is going to be our alpha index, and our string value is going to be our HTML alpha that we just set up. So I called this HTML alpha because this is literally HTML code, which TextMesh Pro allows you to work with. Okay, so again, this has inserted an alpha character at the very beginning of the conversation, and everything after that character is invisible. And we are going to move this one character at a time by going through this over and over and over until we've gone through all of the characters in our paragraph. Okay, so let's update our NPC dialog text. NPC dialog text.text is equal to displayed text. Then at the very bottom, we're going to say yield return new wait for seconds. And let's set up one more speed variable up here. I'm going to set up another constant for that. Let's say private constant float max type time. I'll set that up as 0.1. So let's say yield return new wait for seconds, max type time divided by our type speed. And then again, make sure that your is typing is equal to false at the very end. Okay, so let's give that a test. Awesome, that looks much nicer. Now, one more thing is that you'll notice is that if we press our interact key while the conversation is being typed, it closes. And then if we try to open it back up again, it just loads back up and doesn't go anywhere. And then it kind of freezes in place. So let's fix that. So we want to set up a method called finish paragraph early. Okay, and this is going to handle what happens when we press the interact key if everything is still typing. So first we want to stop the coroutine. Then we want to finish displaying the text. And then we want to update our is typing bool. Okay, so to stop the coroutine, we can say stop coroutine, type dialog coroutine. To finish displaying the text, well, we can say npc dialog text dot text is equal to p. And to update the is typing bool, we'll just say is typing is equal to false. So we want to go back up to our display next paragraph. Can get rid of this here. So if we make it past this point, then well, we start typing if we are not typing, but we need to handle what happens if we are typing. So else, well, then we are going to call finish paragraph early. And then finally, one tiny little change. So we just want to change this right here because right now, else, this means that the conversation has ended. But I actually want to change this to, yes, the conversation has ended, but also we want to make sure that we're not typing. So that needs to be else if. So we only want to actually end the conversation if we're not typing. If we are typing, then we just want to finish the paragraph early. Let's give that a test. There you go. So we press the E, then it just finishes really quick. And we press E again to actually close the conversation, which is exactly what we wanted. Awesome. There you go, guys. Thank you so much for choosing this video to learn how to make a dialogue system in Unity. We are working really hard to grow this channel. So if you liked this tutorial or it helped you in any sort of way, then please give it a like, share, comment down below, all those magic YouTube buttons. I would really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Also, if you like the art assets that you see in this project, you can actually download them for free. You can even use them commercially without giving credit or anything. They are completely yours to do with what you want. I just want to make learning game development as easy for as many people as possible. I hope that you have an amazing day. Bye.